back. Another episode of the 706 on the Father's Day special, the movie that we hoped everyone watched with their father, Tu Mamá También, the 2001 Mexican film that features Tenoch and Julio as they sort of, on the surface, we'd say a typical sort of coming of age road trip movie, but as it's kind of filled with a myriad of disasters, economic situations, social upheavals throughout the nation. And the movie sort of kicks off from there. I don't want to give too much away. I'd rather go straight into the opinions because Kirk seemed ready to give one right away. So without further ado, let's introduce ourselves and give an opinion. Kirk, why don't you start?
Well, hey, folks. I'm Kirk. I am the layman of the bunch. I feel like sometimes I'm outmatched by certain movies, and maybe I miss larger themes or grander tones or motifs that I'm meant to appreciate. And so this might be an instance of that. That's kind of my forewarning. I did enjoy this movie. I thought it was, I'm looking for a word that's similar to naturalistic. There's something about it that really kind of engrosses you. You feel alive when you're watching this movie. You feel like you're kind of like almost like you can feel the temperature. You can, sense the smells and the tastes and the sounds of the Oaxacan wilderness and countryside and the beaches. And I guess it's a great work in demonstrating how to build atmosphere. And I think it really excels in building a certain atmosphere. I also like that we, as Americans and, consumers of major American cinema, we tend to not really see much Mexican produced, created, created, sure, but not necessarily set in Mexico, in Spanish, without the sort of cliched overtones of drugs and violence. I don't really think there was any violence in this film or intimation of violence, like cartel violence or anything like that, which I thought was refreshing because, we can only have so many Sicarios, so many Breaking Bads. And it becomes too much and it becomes stereotypical and problematic in its own way. So this was a great kind of contrast to that. And, similar to like a film like Footnote, where it felt like kind of a candid, endogenous look at a country, a country that I've never been to, that speaks a different language than I speak. It felt really kind of invigorating and novel. As far as the actual movie, the plot, the characters, the general story arc, I thought it was lacking in certain areas. Maybe not necessarily lacking. I really did not need the gratuitous amount of sexuality, sensuality. It was kind of off-putting. It felt borderline exploitative at certain points. Like this was like a movie made for 17-year-olds to masturbate to at their friends' houses while their friends are asleep upstairs. Like, okay, I will put a disclaimer here stating that I may very well be missing like a political angle to this, or like a socio-political angle to this that contextualizes the sexuality and just the constant focusing on nothing else than carnal pleasure. Okay, so this woman, we find out at the end of the movie she's going to die. And so it seems like this is like her last hurrah. She meets up with these two teenagers, or I don't know how old they are, 18 maybe, and they go on a road trip to the ocean. And so she has cancer all along. She just found out her husband cheated on her. So she's kind of in a transitional phase, and it seems like she wants to live life more. But, there's not much in this movie aside from sex, like sex, talking about sex, thinking about sex, totemizing sex, like through masturbation. And so to me, the point the movie is trying to make, or one of the points, is that like sexual liberation and just sexual indiscrimination is equivalent to living a fulfilling life. And I think that couldn't be further from the truth, actually. I think it's a sign of immaturity to be just, kind of sexually indiscriminate. Of course, there's sexual repression, which has its own set of problems. But I mean, talk to any sex addict and, the seeds of what is going on, it starts to become compulsive. It starts to not become transactional, or, it's not reciprocal. It's dehumanizing, right? It's about this kind of carnal, refracted pleasure, wish fulfillment. And so in that sense, I'm not really sure what I was supposed to get from the film other than just kind of like good vibes. And I knew she was going to die at the end because the film really didn't have much of consequence going on throughout it. And for it to be like a great film, I knew someone was going to die. And but that being said, I did enjoy it. Like, it moved me at the end. So I'm kind of confused. Like, I don't know where I stand, but I would really like to hear responses after initial impressions to like what purpose the sex fulfilled. I guess it's also about like coming of age and maturity, but as far as like, the line at the end, which I think is meant to be the biggest line in the film, like, life is like foam, so be like the sea or something. Like, I think to me, it's trying to say that loving freely is like living fully. And so I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. I think it's a little one-dimensional, a little immature, but I'll pass it on to the next person.
Yes, life is like the foam, so give yourself away to the sea, I think is the translation in the captions. But no, it's interesting. I mean, very obviously different reasons for why you have kind of some of the qualms, I guess maybe complaints is too strong of a word. It reminds me of the way you talked about actually with Blue Velvet and some of that gratuity or sex, as you called gratuitous and borderline, which is interesting. But won't carry on too far with that. The only other thing I'll say is it's very interesting. I think in the Criterion cut, Slava Žižek actually has like an essay on this when she says that watching this movie is almost better than going to Mexico itself and for what it could teach you. Because like you were saying, Kirk, that usually we have a Breaking Bad or a drug cartel type movie with the sepia amber-esque tones that does not exist, of course. And it's sort of a one-dimensional, but this gives us kind of an interesting look, especially as those voiceovers I think are very interesting, and maybe we could talk about that later. But next person, let's go with Connor, since he hadn't seen it, I believe. And Connor, you're a self-proclaimed Gael Garcia Bernal fan. How did you feel about this movie? How did it stack up? How did you think? What about the movie worked or didn't work for you?
Yes, well, just to introduce myself, hi everybody, I'm Connor. I would consider myself the Coomer of the group. I adhere to Coomerism in all things. I did not find this movie erotic enough. I was sold a false bill of goods. I was told this was the steamiest, hottest thing. In the end of the last episode, I had the candles out and everything. The mood was right. I was a little disappointed in that respect. No, of course, there is some eroticism in this movie. It's interesting that was kind of the first thing that was sold to me. Like I was thinking on those terms. That was kind of what I was expecting. This is going to be all about sex, right? So in that ways, I think I was kind of let down a little bit, or not let down, but rather my expectations were subverted a little bit when I watched it on those grounds. So I think I don't have the same objection to it as Kirk might, though I could see why it might seem gratuitous. I think my feelings were though substantially similar to Kirk's. It was like a very pleasant road trip film that was kind of heartwarming and interesting characters. And I think the main motion and where the sex kind of comes in, right, is this sort of, you can describe it simply, right, as the kind of transition from a kind of juvenile sexuality to a more true sensuality, right? The transition from, sex being all about ego in some way in your performance with your male friends, right, to being about the woman in some ways, right? This is kind of an initiation for them. Of course, like, there's many things you could possibly say about this. Obviously, I think, one thing we could address on paper, right, is this relationship, right, that Louisa has to these two boys, is this itself, in our age of Me Too, could we think about this as abusive, right? That's something I think probably Anthony was waiting to address. It's kind of a topic that could come up. I think obviously when we watch it, it doesn't feel nearly so clear cut, right? If we're not just looking at, a list of ages and just a vague outline of the situation. I don't find it abusive. If anything, I think Louisa is a kind of character who feels almost not quite the empowered woman, in the fact too that she dies at the end. She's kind of this disposable, sort of loose woman figure who acts as this kind of initiator into sex, and that she kind of disappears at the end somehow, kind of conveniently. I don't know. There's something about it where she feels kind of disposable. I'm not sure if that's completely fair, because at the same time, Louisa is kind of the sort of heart of the movie in terms of her values and her vision of life, and the movie is really more about Louisa and her perspective on life, right? And I would say, to Kirk's other point, I think I did see evidence of something more. I see kind of a social commentary aspect in the fact of these connections to contemporary politics, right? Tenoch is the son of a major politician in Mexico who had to flee to Vancouver at some point. So he's kind of the son of a corrupt politician. And there's a lot of sort of, we're not taking really cartels at this point, which is interesting. I hadn't even thought about the comparison to modern Mexico and our modern images of Mexico. But at this point, right, it's kind of the topic, or the political interest of the movie is sort of in alluding to, right, kind of political corruption, right, of the federal government. We see kind of federales like arresting some people. There's a reference to like a massacre of protesters or something, I forget exactly. And I have to disclaim all knowledge of the actual situation. I want to learn more. I wish I had done a little bit of more research before we had this conversation, just to be able to say. But I think obviously there's kind of this connection of, right, and there's some element of commentary. However, what does that do for the movie? Because again, it is a very convincing road trip of some urbanites, rich urbanites, maybe with the exception of Gal Garcia Bernal's character, who's kind of called a hick, right? But himself kind of runs into Tenoch's same circles. These are all kind of urbanites who are moving to the country, right, to have an encounter with the real Mexico. And yes, they're kind of fishes out of water. They've been kind of out of touch. But then too, there's this kind of aspect, and it's a very convincing view of kind of what tourism can feel like. It can be this encounter with a more authentic life outside of our kind of bubbles of urbanism or bourgeois kind of globalist sophistication or whatever. And it felt very real for that reason, and very much like taking a trip. But at the same time, it is this kind of privileged, kind of swanning around. And I think, is the movie trying to say, yes, Connor, you're on to something, that yes, in fact, these are a bunch of rich kids kind of just playing, and they're never really getting to the real Mexico, or they can't quite see, or is this a place where they're going to encounter and rethink their lives? Is this a place, I don't know. So basically I'm saying the movie is addressing and hinting at these things, but I think I would charge it with not quite transcending those issues, or kind of, there's no confrontation of these different themes with each other, such that it doesn't quite elevate itself above that level. However, I would say that as a road trip movie, think about it this way, as a kind of take on, like the teen sex comedy, it's quite like an elevation. It's quite a deep treatment of these topics. And I respect it for that, but I can't say I loved it, though it's, great performances and great acting and great scenery and all of this. But there's something thematically lacking for me, but I'm sure Anthony will fill me in to a much greater extent. That's my take.
No, it's very interesting. I like the idea of the tourism element. But last but not least, we'll let Tony introduce himself. He's seen this movie once before, I believe, and let's see how his second time around came. And did you watch this movie with your dad?
I did. I watched it with my dad. I watched it with my nephew, who's 6. I watched it with my priest. And we had a great time. We had a really interesting discussion. That's actually on my other podcast. What's the one with Michael Pitt? Pittsburgh. We talked about it on Pittsburgh. It was a little bit of a departure, but so yes, I'd seen this once before, and I remembered it's one of those many movies I saw, years ago, and kind of like put it in the I liked it or whatever, and didn't really think about it too deeply. you know, so I didn't remember a lot of what actually happened in it when I watched it this time, but I feel like I had a much deeper and stronger reaction to it this time, because I think what I wanted to do when I was watching it was kind of tie all these things together, tie a nice little bow, and like have a really grand reading where all these themes, the tourism, the social classes, the politics, the sex, all these things kind of come together into some really elegant thematic package. And as the movie ended and I started thinking about it more, I kind of made peace with the fact that like, I don't know that I need to love this movie, because to me, this movie is about this feeling, and it conjures it very powerfully, of like really painful nostalgia. Like, I think this is such a sad movie. It's a tremendously sad movie. And maybe it's because I'd already seen it and I knew like how it ended, but like there's something so like painful about it. And you feel it throughout, I think. Things like when Louisa leaves the voicemail for her husband, who we never see again after that wedding scene towards the beginning. We never see him again in the movie. We hear the phone call from him, then he leaves this voicemail, and we're in her apartment. And we have this camera just kind of looking around the apartment, and it feels like a ghost. It's like very like haunting. It's just like standing around, like looking around the apartment, looking at her stuff, looking out the window, and there are people out the window. And these long shots. This is shot by Emmanuel Lubezki, who's worked with Cuarón a number of times, including on A Little Princess, which is obviously very different style. But they're kind of known for doing these like really long shots, like in like Children of Men or something, like these really epic, huge, like tour de force, like amazing set pieces. This movie doesn't have those, but it does have these very long shots. I think very early in the movie, like the first sex scene is all done in like one shot, which is very technically impressive in its own right, albeit less showy. But there's not a static, smooth movement. It feels kind of handheld, kind of like, and there's a slight waver to it. So even in these really long scenes where we just see characters talking or doing whatever, the camera will kind of move a little bit. So it feels like we're just standing there. We're just watching. We're in the room. And there's kind of an intimacy to it and a slight discomfort. And I think that's the feeling the movie maintains the whole time. This feeling of maybe I shouldn't be here. That idea of maybe I shouldn't be here with these tourism scenes, and our characters are interacting with all these characters who are in far worse, far more precarious situations. Like, they're these young guys, they're coming of age. They're like, am I going to be a writer? Am I going to be an economist? Where's my life? Am I going to go to college? These kind of like, navel gazy things we all have, I certainly have had my share of times thinking about those things and spent countless hours agonizing over those decisions, and still do to an extent. But you're seeing these people who are in these horrible situations, and the voiceover in this very dry, almost monotone, will say, oh yeah, next year they all died. Or like, oh yeah, this guy never fished again. They lost their home. And you're hearing about like the horrible things that are happening completely outside of these characters' awareness. The narrator is kind of like this omniscient voice who can see in the past, can see in the future, can see these horrible things happening completely outside of the awareness of our main characters. And when the voiceover comes in, it always does it in the same way. The sound will cut out for like a second or two. So there's this kind of sobering interruption, which just takes you out of what you're watching and kind of bringing you back to reality, saying like, but here's what really happens. Here's what's going to happen. Here's what they don't know. And what I think the movie does that I think is pretty brave is it doesn't make the movie about like taking these characters to task for their privilege or taking these characters to task for being oblivious. It's just a fact we have to accept that we don't know. There are things outside of our awareness. There are things happening all around us that we are completely unaware of and that we're powerless to really change. And there's a real sadness and a real tragedy to that. And this sense of kind of this impotent complicity in this horror, where like we find out as we go that Tinnock in particular, his father's done some like terrible things. We find out like midway through the movie that his father sold like rotted or like poisoned corn to poor people. It's like really like obscene. And he said he hadn't felt this bad since he heard that. So he's aware of this and he just lives with that kind of cognitive dissonance his whole life, but he's still out having fun, doing drugs, doing this road trip. And just like the movie never really like brings that to a head or brings us to some epic confrontation or a yelling thing. But I feel like the way the movie handles it feels a lot more real and a lot more painful. We don't get that catharsis. We don't get that resolution. Life just kind of continues. And yeah, I mean, obviously everything we said, I mean, the movie's very beautiful visually. I love the performances, but I think there is something, but I'll just close on that. Just the idea of this movie being, there is something very sad about this movie, very haunting about this movie. And I really do think there's more to it than just like not that this is what Kirk said, but just like kind of an indulgent road trip sex romp. I don't think it's that at all. I think there's a lot more going on to it. And I think the tension between the joy and the life of those scenes, kind of the stunning viscerality and intensity of those scenes and the pleasure that these characters experience and the horror they're encountering on their journey. I think that's kind of what's at the heart of the movie. And I think there is in fact something deep about that. There is in fact something troubling about that. So I felt very, very positively about it.
No, it's interesting and very well put, Tony. And I also find it fascinating, just as a quick side note, because Tony's someone who normally has a hard time relating to sort of the traditional coming of age tale. So it's interesting to see the kind of relations or the personal notes that you felt here and the way they resonated with you in its different ways. But I think the way to talk about this movie, and also to talk about a little of what you were touching on, Tony, with like the sadness and the haunting and the tragic element here, and maybe to touch on what some of Kirk's qualms were, is one thing I find very fascinating about this movie is its production history, real quick, which you don't need to know this, of course, to make the movie a better or worse experience, but it's kind of interesting to know because it comes into the movie at one point, which is that essentially Mexican cinema was like dying, if not dead, for decades. When in the 90s, the government decided to basically fund new programs to basically rebuild the cinema industry in the country, which became a period known as like the new Mexican cinema, the Nuevo Mexicano. But one thing that happens is throughout the 90s, the political party that's essentially been in place for the last 7 presidents, 70 plus years, starts to crumble. And there's beginning awareness that all this is going to fall apart soon. And we get that line one moment in the movie where they talk about how after decades of years, the PRA is finally expected not to be holding the office of president soon. This happens when they're at the kind of party in the beginning when they first meet her and her husband. And I think that's interesting because essentially one thing that happens is all sorts of movies that never would have been produced in this type of country, in this conservative environment, essentially be allowed to be made. And in that route comes Tu Mamá También. And I think that plays into it because there's a sense of imminent collapse, as Tony was kind of getting at, running throughout the movie from start to finish. And we don't necessarily sense it with the kids or the teenagers, Tanak and Julio, until the very end when they finally depart and we get one line that they'll never see each other again. But all throughout the movie, we get those lines, the fishermen will be run out by the end of the season. The people will have to be dislocated, or all these tragic stories, both historical and those still to come. And I think that is true of what Tony was getting at, all sorts of like ways that are there. And so the other angle then to make is also then the relationship itself. What does it mean? Because we've had kind of a assumption, I think, of the one, there's Tanak, who's of course the most privileged, I guess, in today's parlance. And then there's Julio, who's sort of the urban working class, still working class, but definitely privileged to some extent because of his urban environment. But all through in the early moments of the film, I think what's interesting is we never see their original girlfriends again, although we've heard that they've obviously like cheated on each other with each other's girlfriends. We get these kind of moments and they're almost always seen to one up each other, sort of a hyper masculine moment. And we get these other moments in the early parts of the film when we see this, the way they actually live. And I love the way we see, the moment that of course inspires Roma, when Tanak is sitting on the couch and the phone rings and the camera goes to the maid and we follow the maid for a moment as she's not only preparing food, but has to handle all these other responsibilities. We also see through Julio's side, the sister who's marching in the political protest, all sorts of things that are coming to a head that of course have no happy, optimistic, or at least end in kind of a tragic result, all sort of there. And I think what the movie does, as Tony was saying, is not offer us the grand narrative, but offer us, as Connor was saying, the tourist view in its most positive aspect. How can we see this country as tourist and yet see it as it really is? On one hand, from the view of teenagers, essentially 17, 18-year-olds, from the view of a woman ready to kind of pass away after her husband has cheated on her, and from brief glimpses into the poverty that's essentially inescapable, precarious, and just ultimately horrific to ever endure. And I think that's something that I've never quite seen in another movie, at least in another country like Mexico. Maybe like you've seen it in France in this kind of grand romantic sense, maybe in the sort of French New Wave tradition, but I've never seen it quite here. And that's all sort of the reasons I love this movie, because I've seen this movie like 3 or 4 times and I love it every time, love it more every time. So something about it works for me. And maybe I'm a little too happy about it. Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe I'm missing the flaws, as Kirk and Connor were getting at. But, with that being said, maybe we could dive into that, because I think you almost need to start with the relationship itself, and the relationship not between the two boys, but also between them and the woman. So for Kirk, let me throw this at you since you were talking about it, feeling weird about it. What about those scenes felt borderline to you? What kind of disturbed you there? And for that matter, let me just say it's interesting is there's always a lot less like female nudity in the movie than I remember, to be honest. It's there, but I feel like in the usual tradition of how we see nudity on film, the males' asses and penises are much more up front and center.
Okay, so let me just clarify one thing, which is that I'm not opposed to nudity. In fact, Tony once showed me his collection of pornography. It was like 18 DVD binders. It was just incredible. And I said, this guy's my friend. I have to be okay with nudity like he is. So I'm not opposed to nudity. I guess my reservation as I finished the movie was that I felt that the nudity, the sex, the constant talking about sex, like even at that bar scene at the end when they're drunk, they're talking about how to eat women out. They're talking about, fingers up the ass. It's like, when is enough enough? And I'm looking at it from a perspective of like, isn't there more meaningful dialogue that you could have inserted here? Like, isn't there? Truly, is talking about whether or not they're circumcised or not, or whether or not how fast they come. I guess that's somewhat relevant to like insecurity, but when the narrator came in, that's great. But I guess my problem isn't that there's too much, it's that there's not enough of the other stuff. And I guess it's more visual, it's more kind of implicit, or you have to kind of tease it out yourself. And that's okay. I think my main qualm, if I can kind of summarize it here, is that I found the two main characters disinteresting, right? Like I think there was more background given for the cheating husband than there was for Julio. Like, we don't know anything about Julio, really. We know his mom works as a secretary at a foreign company. And so these kids, they're just kind of, they're horn dogs. We don't really have too much there. I know, his dad wants him to be something else and he wants to be a writer. Wow, mind blowing. Please tell me more. I'm so interested. But sorry, I'm being a little rude there. But I guess so. What happened for me is I gravitated towards Luisa. It's very powerful when she's crying. She's on the phone and Hano or Yano tells her that he cheated on her, and that's very moving. But I guess where I run into issues is that if I'm following her and I'm kind of looking to her for some sort of depth here, where does that lead? Because ultimately it seems like she just goes on this hedonistic fuckfest at the end of her life. And so like, what am I learning here? Like, is she the same as them? Is it that she's teaching them how to be lovers? I really don't understand what she's doing. Is it kind of like nihilistic in the sense that like, well, nothing matters, I'm about to die, so I might as well just fulfill carnal pleasures? I really didn't understand what her motivations were in retrospect, knowing that she was going to die. She was just going to have some fun. And then that's where it comes back to like, I think we're meant to see what she did, the decisions she made, as like an affirmation of life. And for me, all I saw was just a bunch of sex. So that's where I get tripped up. Anyways, I appreciate what you said, Anthony, about kind of the political elements in Mexico at the time. And so that really sheds some light and brings some context to it. And I can understand how this movie is provocative and a statement all at once, and a breath of fresh air and kind of a dismissal of the old order. But that doesn't necessarily mean I think it's well written. I think it's beautifully shot, and I really do. And I think it's a moving film, and ultimately that's kind of what matters. But so maybe this is a little nitpicky, but I don't understand Luis's motivations, and I don't find the other two characters interesting enough to really kind of dive into their headspace. Yeah, I guess that's where I'll leave it. Anyways.
Did you want to say something, Tony?
Yeah. So there was a lot there. I think that for one thing, that last scene you're talking about where they're at dinner and they're talking and you're like, why are they still talking about sex? I think that's part of the point is they've been the whole time because for context, these two best friends have had this awful falling out or they realize they have both been with each other's girlfriends, this horrible betrayal. And they're like furious at each other. But what, of course, they're really mad about was the infidelity to one another. They broke one of the rules, right? They broke one of the rules of this bond they share because the whole idea is that these guys, and it's a little bit hack, the movie basically spells it out for us. They're in love with each other. Obviously, they're in love with each other. And this very broy, masculine performance they're putting on, and they're like, jerking off together. It's very like homoerotic the whole time. Like very, very, even if the movie didn't spell it out for us, I think we would have found that anyway, right? And to me, that last scene where they're at dinner together, there's something so joyous about seeing them just like having fun and laughing. They're laughing about this. They're like, oh, actually, it was way more than once. It was a bunch of times. They're like, oh man, it was a bunch of times for me to do it. And they're just laughing at it. And to me, like, there's something so like pure about that. I don't know, just like the idea that like they cannot take it personally, that they can just find pleasure in life and laughter together. And that's what the movie's about, is like those moments of laughter, those moments of joy, those moments of pleasure. Right. Like, I love that last bit. I love the crudity of it. I love the fun they're having and they're just having fun. I think the whole point of that last scene is that they're having fun together. They're not having some like deep conversation about life, but that's not really what life is about. Life is about those moments when you can just have fun, when you can share a moment with somebody. And I think that to me, like, as far as from Louisa's perspective, oh, is it nihilistic that she's going off and like fucking these boys or whatever? Like, I don't see it that way at all. I see it as like, I mean, you said an affirmation of life, but I do think it is, because think about it. How much sex is there really in the movie? There's a lot for a movie, for sure. It takes us aback because we're not used to seeing this in a movie, especially not as graphic or as prolonged as we do. But how many times she does it like twice in the whole movie? And it takes place over like several weeks. So really, from her perspective, it's not that much. She even says like halfway through the movie, I'm not doing that anymore. She says she draws a line in the sand. And yes, she kind of does at the end, but whatever. It's the end of the movie, right? So I feel like to me, it's just about having an experience, going on a journey, having fun and sharing a moment. And to me, like, those scenes are about a moment of connection between two people. It's not like, oh, it's just carnal pleasure. It's just like, oh, this is just trying to get the audience off. To me, it's like the movie finds beauty and it finds grace in those scenes.
Yeah, I find it really interesting is like every time I've like shown this movie to someone or every time they see it for the first time, everyone wants to talk about the kind of like last sex scene. And I'm surprised no one brought it up in their like initial impression or whatever, because to get to your point also, Kirk, is like she kind of disappears from that. It's implied, right? Like the kind of threesome happens, all of a sudden she's down and then she's gone. And we get the brief moment where they kind of kiss or whatever. And even the next morning, they kind of wake up in bed and she's already out there. She seemingly disappeared from the sex entirely, as Tony was kind of getting at. So I think that's also important to bring up. But I also like what Tony was saying about the kind of importance of there not being a sort of deep conversation there, because all throughout the movie, the deep conversations are really happening by the narrator. The narrator is kind of the one who's espousing that, while the rest of the movie is kind of trying to find that balance of brevity in life, I think, as well. And I think it's kind of a great moment. I also share Tony's kind of opinion on the way that scene kind of comes off portrayed, and also the moment when the camera kind of leaves them and we're stuck in between, and Maribel Verdú's character, Luisa, essentially just dances for the camera, which is a moment I absolutely love, and like one of like Lubeski, I think, is like best shot sequence I've ever seen him do, which is very interesting to me. But Connor, do you want to say any more about the tourism aspect or anything else? Because how do you feel now with some of those qualms that you shared with Kirk?
I would say, I really just hearing you guys, especially Tony, talking about it, I think I have a different perspective, right? That feeling of wrongness is intentional, right? That we're supposed to feel, and Tony's ultimately right that, like, yes, it's actually way more mature in a way, right? To let the contradiction be there, right? And to have these things play out, because that is life, right? And that is tourism, right? And I hadn't even mentioned the idea of the narrator, which Anthony has brought up, and the real importance of the narrator to the way the story is told. So I think you have to have that tension there. That really is what the movie is about, is right, that tension. And then despite of that, right, yes, these kind of interpersonal moments that are, maybe not as meaningful as we would like them to be, but that it's about interaction, between each other, not necessarily what we reveal in discourse, with each other. I really like what you guys are arriving at, and I find I have more respect. I think my point to the issue of tourism, I think it is absolutely. I mean, I think again, it's beautiful, it's wonderful the way it captures that experience. But I think you can't deny, right, that it is, so they sort of are in a bubble, right? They are kind of encountering. I'm not sure to the extent that, right, the fact is that they don't necessarily learn that much, right? The narrator tells us, but they don't necessarily learn all of these facts. I think it's kind of a tragic, and I like Tony's general point that it's tragic. Back to Louisa and Kirk's point, I think Tony didn't quite, I think what Tony mentioned in the beginning, that this is a sad story. This is a tragic story. I think, could we apply that too to Louisa and her own motivations, and maybe not see her motivations as necessarily, though Tony was pushing back against the idea that her motivations may be bad or not quite there or not quite. I think we could say Louisa's motivations are in fact kind of bad in a way. Obviously kind of movingly human, but bad nevertheless. In that, like there's clearly, she has her own insecurity. I think the first kind of seduction scene, which is very memorable, but, kind of wrong, kind of feels wrong. And I think for her, it is kind of wrong in a way. And she ultimately regrets doing it. And once she's had sex with Tenoch, then she feels she has to have sex with Julio. And that scene is not quite as startling. But I think that first seduction, right, she's just like talked to her, her ex or her husband, and she's not quite over, right? There's this insecurity, and you get that maybe this is what she was kind of planning to do. And the sort of the ego of both parties kind of collides in that moment. On the one hand, these boys, said like, of course there was the kind of pretext of like, yeah, we're going to have sex with her, I guess, right. Without really ever thinking it through. He's not really ready for actually encountering the possibility of having sex with her. And he's like a little boy in that moment. She, on the other hand, right, is totally has power over him. Right. It's this moment that feels a little bit wrong if we're talking again, kind of power balance stuff. And I think the movie can kind of recognize that, though it's not harshly judgmental. I think it can kind of recognize that this maybe is Louisa indulging herself, indulging her own needs, but in a way that we recognize as human, flawed but human, right? And that leads to a further kind of development, right, of her realizing that was wrong, and they're not going to have sex. But then, right, through this kind of encounter and through this back and forth, they've forged a more real bond that is sensual and deep and hard to put into words. And I'm curious, honestly, I kind of discounted, and this may be homophobic in a way, I kind of really discounted the possibility of Julio and Tenoch being lovers. For some reason, when I see that kiss at the end, it's kind of a metaphor for me. It's like, oh yes, they're kissing because, and of course we don't have to be afraid of being gay with each other. Like, we're sensual beings, like we can kiss too. But I still don't read them as kind of canonically like a lover pair. I see them still as more as friends. So I haven't really taken that into account. It's right there on the surface. It's obviously there. But I kind of had failed to really think about that more deeply. Still, I kind of stand by my general impression that it's almost metaphorical, or it's almost kind of just sealing their bond.
Sealing their bond, but also at the end, they never see each other again after the diner scene, which is also kind of fascinating because there's a sense of, right, that kind of finale scene, I guess, the threesome or that whatever, however you read it, it's been read so many different ways. They're kind of finally throwing off their sort of hyper masculine ways to kind of embrace each other at last in a sort of homosexual moment. The also kind of the fact that they don't see each other again as based in class, a sort of idea promoted by the director himself, but all sorts of different ways. But I think what you're onto is kind of interesting is all this movie, as it happens, essentially Julio and Tenoch get what they want. Everything they want essentially comes their way. They find the car when they don't have the car. They get the money when they don't have the money. They don't actually know of a place to go, even though they lied and claimed they knew of a secret beach spot. And all of a sudden they stumble on the perfect secluded area. They joke about having sex with Louisa, and then it actually comes true for both of them and then each other. The one thing that they don't vocalize, which is sort of the embrace of each other, seems, as Tony was saying, all there though throughout their conversation. And it does kind of imply that it finally happens. And once it finally happens, they get pulled away to the other end. They never see each other again, however tight that bond is. And in that diner scene, it seems to be a very awkward tense exchange in which, Tanakh places the kind of privileged upper hand of paying for the meal when Julio's not looking, I guess, which is all kind of interesting, I think. But I think we could sort of move on to the vote unless anyone has any final points. We'll let Tony go first.
Okay. And one last thing I'll say about this too, and I alluded it to earlier with like the pain of nostalgia, but what I think what this movie captures for me is just that idea of like thinking back on past events in your life and feeling kind of a pain and kind of a like, oh, like what did, like I don't know if I handled it right, or I don't know if I did it right, or I don't know if I couldn't hold on to that moment, or I couldn't do something different, but also having no clue what you could have done different too, knowing that if you were to do it again, you would have made the exact same decisions. And I think that is such a specific feeling that this movie just nails, because these guys don't have that awareness. Part of the importance of them not having the deep conversations themselves, is they're not capable of it. They can't vocalize those things. They can only kind of feel them, and then later have that vague sense that they missed something, or that there's something they could have done or something they missed. And I think that feels to me so true and so painful and just so human. So I love this movie unequivocally. I think it's amazing. So it's a yes for me.
Nice. I agree. We'll go with Kirk. Kirk second, if he's ready.
You're expecting a no from me, aren't you?
I never know with you, Kirk.
So, I think I made some mistakes coming into this movie. One, the idea that it's Criterion, right? There's a certain expectation one has when they come into a Criterion film, rather than like finding this kind of organically, spontaneously on some sort of channel late at night, right? Two, reading subtitles, I often don't feel like it has much effect, but in this film, I feel like it did, because, you use a certain part of your brain, literally, and just kind of more generally, to kind of process the text. And it's very fast moving, which for me, I kind of have this brain where I want to make sure I'm getting all the nuances of the text. And so I'm in this like textual analysis, while at the same time trying to enjoy this movie that's a lot about vibes and this ineffable quality, right? And so those contradict each other at times and work against each other. And I think that worked against it for me. If this film had been in a language that I speak natively, and I hadn't needed to use subtitles, or if I spoke Spanish, whatever, I think the movie would have resonated with me more. So that is a egocentric complaint, of course, but nonetheless an observation. Three, I will just say, Tony at one point, he said something like, well, not all these conversations have to be about the meaning of life. Sometimes we can just have fun. Well, I mean, I could defend grown-ups too with the same sentence, but I'll pass on that. Anyways, I understand that this film, it's like, it's not Terrence Malick's like, opus. Like this is more about, this is a mimetic, naturalistic, and like painful and harrowing film that's more about the journey and less about those poignant moments of dialogue, even though they are there. Like, the creator is capable of it because he inserts it with the narrator. And so then I find that I want more. And perhaps it's just that the characters themselves, like Tony said at the end, aren't capable of that type of conversation. I'm still a little confused by what Louise is kind of doing, if she's resigned herself to death, or like the most important question is like, what is her relationship with the boys? Like, what is she doing in that situation? Did she know what she was getting herself into at the beginning? What did she try to extricate herself from it towards the end once she accomplished something? I'm not sure. Maybe I have to rewatch it, and I'm just probably being quite stubborn here. But I will say that I appreciate movies that make me feel like profound sadness. I wasn't teary-eyed, but it was close. And despite all the obstacles that I felt I had encountered throughout, I think that's actually a grand testament to the film's ingenuity and efficacy. So I will say that, and execution, I will say that for that alone, it should be a yes. And my complaints can be viewed as kind of, personal qualms that maybe I'm yelling at clouds. But anyways, it's a yes from me.
I was hoping for another flipper, like it should be a yes. However, it has to be a no. So
yeah, that was quite the roundabout way. I'm glad we got the yes. I'm glad that the first non-English film that Kirk has ever seen was a yes. But let's move on.
You know what?
Let's move on to Connor, who's last but not least.
Okay, so just a few parting shots, things I wish I had said earlier that I forgot to say. So to the issue of Louisa, and I'm glad Kirk brought up, her motivations again. What is she about? What's going on too? There's also, remember the moment where she talks about her boyfriend, who was kind of the love of her life, and he was 17 years old when he died, right? And so I think we can see this a little bit, though how much is there in the text when she's initially deciding to go on the trip, I'm not sure, but surely there's an encounter, right, to get back to that life that she lost, right? That kind of that youth, which she can't really access. I mean, now she's a much more, more experienced person than they are. The power levels are not the same. The experience is not the same, but there's a desire to go back to that time. And it's kind of tragic in its way that she can't have that youthful romance, but she kind of wants to return to it. And it's kind of a, sort of infantile, desire, but one we can kind of understand given the circumstances of her life being kind of upended like this, right? And this being the end of her life. So again, there's a kind of tragic beauty to that. I have to say, again, this is a great example of the power of the logos, of persuasion. I've been very moved to see your guys' points and I think evaluate this movie in a much better way than I did upon first watching. A lot of my qualms have evaporated. At the same time, I can't deny that just as a personal experience of watching, I wasn't in love with it. I wasn't, I still don't necessarily want to go back and watch it again. We'll see. Maybe that'll change as these ideas settle into my psyche a bit more and I think more about the movie. But given as it's already in the 706, I'm going to give it a soft no, but I have to say I really like what we've been able to say about it.
Yeah, fair enough. And a very interesting point, actually. I always forget about that moment where they talk about her deceased teenage love. So very fascinating. Next time I see it, I'll have to see if there's more there to bring up and maybe help you out if you ever do rewatch it. But it's in. 2 votes. Kirk roundabout, but in. So we'll move on to the fan favorite section in which these 3 nominate a film, and I'll pick what we watched the following week. So who went least recent? Was it Kirk?
It's Connor, and let me just say, if you choose Tony, Connor and I are going to start our own podcast. Just so
you and Connor went back and forth a few times, Kurt.
Yeah,
we're going to start the 353 podcast, half of the 706. So just get ready for that, Anthony.
All right,
I would tread lightly.
My confession is that once again I completely forgot about the recommendation segment, and I failed to choose a movie. So you know what that means? It's time for some frantic searching. Pick one out of a hat. This may be the best way to get one.
Sometimes,
certainly got some good ones on the docket, but I'm just not. Nice. I didn't have one in mind, so I'm going to do that right now. While I'm doing that, please, Kirk, you go first. Tony goes second. I'll go last.
Okay. Let me see here. I was struggling too with this. I'm gonna go. It's kind of a slap in the face to choose this film after what we just watched. This is actually, it's been tough for me trying to tease out a film that because I've been on this populist picks trail. So I'm thinking that I really want to continue that. And I guess in that vein, I will nominate Master and Commander, Russell Crowe. There's a what do you call it? Like a subtitle or a second
Far
title?
Far Side of the World.
Yeah.
Far Side of the World. Yes, I will nominate that movie. Russell Crowe, Paul Bettany. I'm not sure who else is in it. I haven't seen it in a while, but this film, if we want to talk about set design, costume design, like I can't remember if it won the Oscar, but it should have, because they were so meticulous. And it's just a great kind of film that it felt like they wanted to start perhaps a franchise, or they wanted to create a series of these films. I'm not sure. Maybe I'm pulling that out of thin air. But I don't think it did too well at the box office. But it was a major release, and there are some moving parts to this film, and it's kind of an interesting movie for the time and place in which it came out. And if you think about the early 2000s, it really kind of missed its mark, I feel. And it would be interesting for us to look at kind of its contemporaries, its cohort, as it were, and explore what went wrong. Maybe if this movie was too early or too late. Personally, I think it came out too early. I think 10 years later, it does far better. It finds it better, with the proliferation of art draft houses and all that stuff, art house cinemas. So anyways, it's a grand adventure, sweeping adventure, really fun, better than any of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, in my opinion, which kind of came out around the same time. And yeah.
Okay, well, I don't know if it's better than On Stranger Tides, but we'll have to see if I pick your movie, Kirk. So let's.
There's no ship battle in a tornado, I have to say.
All right, Tony, what do you got?
Pirates of the Caribbean on Stranger Tides is a swashbuckling adventure for the. No, it's actually funny you picked that movie, Kirk, because maybe not your last pick, but the one before was. I know it was your last pick. Was Return of the King, which beat Master and Commander for Best Picture that year. It's kind of a funny coincidence. So
I did not know the year. That's actually a complete coincidence. Anyways, good point.
So yeah, I don't know what else. I guess I'll pitch Lost in Translation. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, no, Master and Commander is great. That's a quality movie. I watched it not that long ago. Actually, Connor and I watched it at the same time, like a few months back, and I liked it a lot. I had never seen it before. I'm gonna pick something very different. I think we're gonna do another. I want to do another horror movie. I don't want to be presumptuous here. This is a Japanese horror movie. Takashi Miike. It's developed a bit of a cult following called Audition. It's about a successful businessman who's looking for a new wife. So he decides to have an audition of different young, attractive women to be the wife of this rich, cool man. And things don't go quite as he plans. And that's all I'll say about it. But it's quite an experience, and I think it would fit right in with our. I think it'd be a good next horror movie after Evil Dead. It's a very different style, but I think it would be good to do.
It's very interesting. Tony, you've been on a run of nominating some Japanese flicks lately, right? Was your name also a Japanese film?
Yeah. What did I do before? Yeah. Did I do another one before that? I don't know.
Did what? Perfect Blue.
Oh, that's true. I have picked a lot of Japanese.
Yeah.
I don't know why.
Yeah. But all right, we stalled long enough. There's no running anymore. Connor, what do you have?
Okay, it's time to face the music. I'm going to take a page out of Kirk's book, and I'm going to recommend a Best Picture winner. This time from 1949. I've recommended it before. Now I feel like it's my chance. Anthony's the only one I think would pick this one. It is A Letter to Three Wives, directed by Joseph Mankiewicz. Yes, of Mank fame. If you watched Mank, you should feel kind of obliged to watch this as well, right? To see what all the fuss was about at the height of his directorial and writerly talents. This is just an amazing film that doesn't sound like much. It's about three wives, one of whose husbands goes missing. The question is, whose wife was it? Or whose husband was it? Sorry, can't I botch the explanation? Whose husband is it? They don't know because they're trapped on a boat. Anyway, it's a sort of exploration of relationships at this moment in time in 1949. And I'll tell you, it feels somehow so incredibly fresh and modern in a way that, movies from the 70s, movies from the 80s, movies from the past 10 years don't feel quite as modern in a way as this one does. It somehow captures something that maybe is eternal or maybe we're returning to. I can't say the past 10 years doesn't make much sense, does it? But anyway, then in more recent times, it feels very fresh. And it features, just as Tony used this technique last time, it features a real smoke show of a Hollywood starlet who's now kind of forgotten, Linda Darnell, who's absolutely gorgeous. If you're into Hollywood actresses, Hollywood beauties of the golden age, this is one you can't miss. You really should see it. And this is, I think, her greatest performance. I haven't seen too much of her stuff. I've checked out a few things after watching Letter to Three Wives. She tragically died at a very young age. but this is just a stellar performance from her, and it's got it all. It's got class commentary, musings on love, musings on gender relations, women in the workplace. It's just has everything you would want out of the kind of Hollywood film. And I think we shouldn't forget, I mean, these movies can get they are writers who are very self-consciously trying to take on grand social themes, trying to give a snapshot of their time, painting a way towards a future society. You know, it has it all there, while on the top of being kind of entertaining and having all those great kind of Hollywood bits of repartee and writing that you might expect. I really highly recommend it.
All right, that was interesting. I feel like Connor brought the thunder with that one. He had his great presentation, classic Connor pick, 1940s. He's done it before. He's been wanting to watch this movie for a while. Tony's film is very interesting. Actually, Shay and I read the book and watched the film about 4 years ago, so it's been a long time since I've seen it. Kirk's film, I've only seen bits and pieces in a European history class in high school, and it looked really good then. So there's a lot of interesting things. I don't know where I'm going. I need some rebuttals.
You know, Anthony, if you ever wondered what the buttons looked like on, I don't know what they would be called, colonial merchants or whomever people on, I don't know. I think there were pirates in the film, but the British Armada, like they actually recreated everything, to be era specific. And I think that's really cool. I think that's, something that was dying off at that time. I feel like we were taking a lot of shortcuts, especially with CG kind of around the corner. Looking at you, Two Towers, and I'm just kidding. That obviously was necessary. Maybe
you're referring to the Lord of the Rings film, correct? Not the World Trade Center.
I'll let you decide. No, of course, the Lord of the Rings film. But now, in retrospect, it sounded bad. Connor's film, I saw it has Jean Crane, the sister, cousin, I believe, who one of you inexplicably thought was Gene Tierney's daughter in the film, which I thought was kind of cute. In what's that film called? I don't even remember. They all blend together, folks. If you've been with us, you can look back in the history. What is it called?
Leave Her to Heaven? No, Leave Her to Heaven.
No, Leave Her to Heaven. I'm sorry.
That was my argument, was that she had a kid as a teenager. Ages somewhat line up.
Yes. So Jean Tierney had a kid when she was 9, and then we all know what happened next. No, it seems like a cool movie. Letter to Three Wives. I mean, I trust Connor on the old stuff. He's kind of sommelier of, in that sense, and he's really a good person. He's got the good stuff. He dishes out the vintage wines and the Pinot, but I don't know. I guess there's not much more to say. I would just say about Tony's movie, I don't know what came to my head was Creep 2. So if it's any better or worse than Creep 2, I'm not sure. But I don't know. It felt a little bit like one of those like socially awkward horror films where things just get awkward and then somebody dies at the end. Yeah. We can also do a segment on Russell Crowe if you pick Master and Commander. I think his career is really fascinating, and Paul Bettany as well. But I think it'd be fun to do a period piece. Have we done a period piece recently, or I don't know?
I'm sure we've definitely done them.
Yeah, but it's
not
it
like
might have
that,
been a while.
Yeah.
Phantom Thread is it's not the same.
Yeah, not like Master and Commander.
This is like a true epic. Yeah, this is great. Mm-hmm. So, anyways, your choice though. Good luck to all involved.
I'll say, Kirk, Command and Conquer 3 is a video game, not a movie. And it's a really mediocre RTS, so I can't really endorse it. As for Connor, I couldn't quite tell what he was saying. He was either saying 3 Wives, 1 Letter, which, I was in 8th grade once. I watched it on the school computer. It was disgusting. Yeah, we all get it. And then Letters from Iwo Jima by Clint Eastwood. Isn't he kind of a fascist? I don't know. So I don't really want to see any of these. Audition is, if we want to scare some people, if we want to put some edge back on our podcast, if we want to put some Monster energy drink, sideways baseball cap, bro. No, it's not a It's not a bro movie, guys. I'm kidding, but it's a nasty little horror movie, and I think we need to foster that corner of the universe a little bit. I think we haven't given it enough water. Let's water that plant with some blood.
Couple more horror movies. We're going to be doing this podcast out of the Spencer Gifts.
Well, like it's that much better right now, Kirk. We won't talk about our digs right now, but yes. Okay, so I really like what Kirk says about Master Commander being an interesting genre. You're right; it is a distinct genre, that kind of period piece adventure epic that is really like a kind of overlooked genre of film outside of a few ones that we attach to as boys ourselves, but it's really interesting to kind of see a movie that, like I said, I've seen it later in life, and it's really cool, Master Commander, and I love the period and early 19th century. It's fascinating, and I didn't love it. I think it'd be worth another shot and thinking about it again and hearing you guys enthuse over, because I think for some reason Tony and I didn't get to really discuss it much. But as for Audition, I've had the entire thing described to me, like beat for beat, by a friend when I was in 9th grade. So I don't know. Is it even worth watching at this point? I don't know. No, I'm sure it's been on my list for a long time, and I'd love to revisit it. But Letter to Three Wives, I mean, come on, what more do I gotta say here? Oh, I'll say one more thing actually. This movie from 1949 features techno. That's all I'll say.
That is some clickbait, man. Are you a YouTuber now?
I just love how
the title of the video. Yes.
Yeah, I love how like when Connor introduced the movie, it was like it feels very modern. We just watched Tu Mamá También, which feels to me very modern of a film. But all right, so Kirk tried to persuade me by knowing my interest in colonial buttons. Tony's film was really fascinating. It's a good one, and I still want to do more horror, but based on the familiarity that we all have in various ways with these movies, I'm going to do the selfish choice of we've been stuck in the 2000s, late 90s for a while now. We got to go back again. And we got to go back with Connor's help once more, leading the way with the movie none of us have seen, but is apparently a very modern flick called Letters to Three Wives. So I'm looking forward to it.
It's about techno, right?
Yes, thank you, Anthony. It is about techno. You really check out the OST. Lots of bangers on it.
That's the first thing I'm going to bring up.
We got Zed. Kirk Douglas.
You're going to love it when it appears. It is a form of techno, or it's important for the development of electronic music, but it's kind of a weird gimmick.
Some vaporwave,
but you'll see in the moment. Guys, I'm so excited. I'm really glad. It was kind of a tough sell. I'm glad I had the right person to choose it, to get it in the door. But once we all watch it, I think we'll all have a lot to say, and it'll be a very interesting conversation. And you guys know I love showing you old movies you might not have otherwise seen. And again, it doesn't quite make the list of kind of big critical hits. The French people didn't love it or whatever. It didn't get mentioned in Cahiers du Cinéma or whatever. So it's kind of an interesting Hollywood classic to revisit. Sadly forgotten, but I think you guys will really find it interesting. So with that being said, Anthony, will you play us out?
I'll have what she's having.